Clause 11. Variations, Provisionals and Prime Cost Sums. This clause is a bit long. There are 9 subclauses. Within some subclauses, there are components, breakdowns for the subclauses. This clause discusses mainly on the variations, the provisional sum, as well as the prime cost sum. Before we look into the clauses, let us first understand what are the meanings of those terminologies. In fact, we have discussed about the relevant terms in our previous videos. First is the variations. It is actually an alteration to the scope of the work, which is different from the original scope of work as per required in the tender document. These alterations can be in the form of additions, substitutions, or omissions. As long as there are changes in terms of the scope of the work, which is different from the original scope of work as agreed between the contractors and the employer, this will be considered under the variations. Next is the prime cost sum. This is the sum provided in the contract related to the nominated subcontractor and also nominated supplier. The works or services executed by this nominated subcontractor, as well as the materials and goods to be supplied by the nominated supplier, will be categorized under the prime cost sum. As for the provisional sum, it is the sum provided in the contract for the work or for the supply of materials and goods which cannot be foreseen, determined, or detailed at the time that the contract is formed. It is either due to insufficient details or details not fully given for a certain scope of work, or the relevant work is not provided with the details at all, such as no technical drawing given. It may also due to the conditions where the relevant scope of work may or may not be carried out during the course of the construction. Due to high level of uncertainty, the relevant costs for the work are considered under the provisional sum. Now that we have some basic ideas regarding those terminology, let us look into the statements as given in the clause. The slide here shows the simplifications for the informations given in the clause 11. For the full statement, you may refer to PAM Contact 2018. First, we talk about the definitions of the variations. It is basically the modifications of the design, quality or quantities of the work, including any of the followings. With these modifications, that means there will be some changes made onto the work and the scope of the work, which was initially agreed between the contractors and the employer. Normally, these kinds of variations will have to be instructed by the architect. The modifications without the instructions of the architect will not be recognized, and as a result, the contractors is unable to claim for the work. Should the instructions given by the architect verbally, the contractor will need to follow up with the confirmations of architect instructions, CAI. This is to place a record that the relevant work which can result in the variations is actually the instructions by the architect. Theoretically, these variations should not vitiate the contract. It means that it shouldn't affect the contract. The contract will still need to be valid, and only for a certain part of the work which is relatively minor as compared to the overall project, involve some modifications or changes, and those changes are related to the design quality and quantities of the work. Now let us look at the circumstances of those modifications. This may include the additions, omissions, or substitutions of any work. Something may be added, or something may be removed, or something may be replaced by another thing. It can also be the alterations of any materials or goods to be used in the work. This may involve changes of the materials, or maybe the specifications of the materials, which is different than what is originally stated in the contract. This may also involve the removal from the site of any work executed on materials and goods which are not in accordance to the contract. That means the relevant work was initially not in the contract but has to be done, and the contractor may claim for the variations. It may also due to any changes to the provisions in the contract with regard to any limitations of working hours, working space, access to or utilizations of any specific part of the site, the executions and completions of the work in any specific orders. These are the circumstances which was unforeseen during the formations of the contract, which initially there was a original planning under the original setting of the conditions. However, due to some unforeseen circumstances, there may be some constraint, and such constraint is not due to the problem of the contractor. It is not due to the ignorance of the contractor or incompetency of the contractor, which is inevitable, not reasonably predicted or foreseen during the stage of the planning. As a result, the relevant costs incurred should theoretically not to be imposed onto the contractor. And these modifications, which is entitled for the variations, does not include those that are to be carried out in order to rectify any negligence, omissions, default, or breach of the contract by the contractor. In another word, if the problem is caused by the contractor, whichever rectification work cannot be considered under the variations. The cost will have to be fully paid by the contractor, and the contractor is not entitled to claim for the cost. This should have been prevented if the contractor is competent and vigilant enough. Next, we talk about when these variations occurs. Under normal circumstances, it can happen anytime before the certificate of practical completions. That means during the project and before the completions of the project. Upon completions of the project, theoretically no variations will involve. The reason being is, before the architect issue the certificate of practical completions, the architect theoretically should have checked through all the relevant work as delivered by the contractor against all the requirements and criteria as stipulated in the contract document. In the case that there are certain parts not fully fulfilled, normally this certificate of practical completions will not be issued. That means it will involve the non-compliance of the contractor. It is only when everything complies and the contractor is clear to go, then the certificate of practical completions will be issued. On this basis, once the contractor has acquired the certificate of practical completions, that means the contractor has already delivered their work as per the contract. Therefore, there is no point to issue for the variations. There will be one circumstances which the variations may involve after the certificate of practical completions. It is only when the modifications is required by the appropriate authorities and service providers. The appropriate authorities is referring to the local authorities, government bodies, departments, in terms of certain requirements, while the service provider are related to the supply of electricity, waters, telecommunication services, and others. The next clause is talking about how this prime cost sum and the provisional sum is recognized. The PC sum here means the prime cost sum. The expectations of the prime cost sum and the provisional sum only happens when the architect issues the architect's instructions. Without the architect instructions, the contractor is unable to claim for the relevant costs. Next, we talk about the valuations of the variations and the provisional sum. This is also quite important, as the natures of the variations is that it was not originally in the contract document. The changes are made with the consent of the employer as instructed by the architect for the contractors to comply, where the relevant scope of work may or may not be having any relevant guides in terms of the claiming that was originally agreed upon between the contractors and the employer, and the relevant works done by the contractor under the variations, which is to be claimed from the provisional sum, will need to be quantified by a recognized person under the contract. This person will either be the quantity surveyor or the architect, depending on the PAM contract that you are using. In the case that you are using the PAM contract with quantities, the valuations and measurements will be done by the quantity surveyor. You know that PAM contract with quantity is that the BQs are given during the tendering process, where the employers had appointed a quantity surveyor for the project. Now, in the case that PAM contract without quantity is being used, on paper, no quantity surveyor is being appointed by the employer, and therefore no BQs are provided during the tendering process. And for this particular project, since there is no quantity surveyor, the architect will take the responsibility to do the measurements and valuations. And when we talk about the variations, it is not only the modifications of the scope of the work, probably the quantity of the works is also modified. And after the work is being done, the contractor will have to claim for the work. Let us reorganize the idea again in order to strengthen your understanding. First, these variations must be instructed by the architect so that it is valid, that the contractor is allowed to make the claim. It can be any of those in the list here, and it normally happens before the issue of the certificate of practical completions. The only conditions when the variations is valid after the certificate of practical completions, which is to fulfill the appropriate authorities and service providers in terms of certain requirements, and whichever work done by the contractor under the variations shall eventually be claimed. Now, the amount to be claimed, you will need a person to regulate the process to ensure the claims are justifiable, not to the advantage of the contractor and also not to the advantage of the employer. It must be fair and just. This will involve a professionals to carry out the task of measuring and valuing. It is dependent on the PAM contract whether it is with or without the quantities. The designated persons for the task will be either the quantity surveyor or the architect.